Before we begin, imagine living in a world where your name, your choices, and even your body belong to someone else. A world where power was enforced through fear, and survival depended on enduring the unendurable. Today, we uncover the story of a man who spent 12 long years enslaved in Virginia in 1832. A story of cruelty, exploitation, and the fight to hold on to humanity in a system designed to destroy it. This is not just history. It is a reminder of the darkness people have endured and the strength they carried despite it. If you're passionate about learning the truths often left out of textbooks, make sure you subscribe. It helps us bring more hidden stories to light. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know. Now, let's begin. In the Commonwealth of Virginia during the autumn of 1820, a man named Solomon Northup lived a free life in the North with his wife and children. He was a farmer, a violinist of considerable talent, and a man of means and standing in his community. What happened next would strip away everything he knew about freedom, justice, and human dignity. Over the course of 12 years, more than 4,380 days, he would be held captive in a system designed to break the human spirit. This is not a story of distant history. This is a documented account of a crime against humanity that unfolded within the borders of the United States of America. The question that drives this investigation is deceptively simple, yet profoundly unsettling. How does a person survive when every institution of power conspires to deny their very humanity? What psychological and physical transformations occur when a free man is reduced to property? And perhaps most disturbingly, what does it reveal about a society that allows such horrors to flourish year after year after year? The narrative we are about to unfold begins with betrayal. It unfolds through moments of resistance that went almost entirely unrecorded. It culminates in a recovery that itself required extraordinary courage and complicated choices. But the foundation of this story rests on a single terrifying truth. In antebellum America, a black person, no matter their status, was perpetually vulnerable to enslavement. There were no guarantees, there were no protections that could not be stripped away in a single night. Free papers could be forged or simply ignored. Legal systems that theoretically protected freedom worked against those seeking to prove it. And the economic incentives to reduce human beings to slave status were so powerful that conscience rarely intervened. This documentary examines 12 years through multiple layers. We will reconstruct the events leading to the capture. We will analyze the psychological mechanisms of coercion and survival. We will document the specific locations and individuals involved in this crime. We will follow the extraordinary efforts required to secure freedom when freedom had been declared legally impossible. And we will consider what this historical episode reveals about power, about resistance, about the nature of institutions designed to oppress, and about the fragility of freedom itself in a nation built partly on slavery's expansion. The man at the center of this account left behind a written testimony. Published in 1853 after his escape, it provides rare first-person documentation of the enslaved experience. But this document is not without complications. It was written for a specific audience. It was edited by white abolitionists. It reflects certain narrative choices designed to persuade. In examining this account, we must simultaneously honor the testimony while remaining critically aware of how narratives are shaped edited, and presented to the public. We must ask, whose version of truth survives? Whose voice remains silent? What does the act of documentation itself reveal about power? The name of this man was Solomon Northup. He was born free. He was raised in Troy, New York. He worked. He built a life. And then in 1841, that life was stolen from him. Solomon Northup was born in 1808. His father, Mintus Northup, had been enslaved in New York but was manumitted, freed by his owner. His mother, Sue, was the child of an African-American father and a white mother. This lineage placed Solomon in a particular category within the complex racial hierarchy of early 19th century America. He was recognized as a free man of color, but this freedom was conditional, contingent, and constantly subject to challenge. In the early 1820s, Solomon and his father lived in Minerva, New York, a rural community in Essex County. The region was part of the emerging North, where slavery was being gradually abolished. Solomon received an education, not extensive by the standards of wealthier children, but sufficient to give him literacy and numeracy. These skills would become both assets and liabilities in the years ahead. By his late teens, Solomon had learned the trade of coopering, barrel making, a skilled craft that provided stable income. He also developed musical ability, learning to play the violin. This instrument became more than a means of earning money. It became an expression of his identity, a marker of his cultured status, and later, a tool for managing his psychological survival under the most devastating circumstances. In 1828, at the age of 20, Solomon married Anne Hampton. She was the daughter of a white family, which at this time and place was legally and socially precarious, but not entirely without precedent. They settled in the village of Fort Edward, New York, where Solomon worked as a cooper and sometimes as a laborer on the Champlain Canal, a major project under construction during this period. He earned a respectable living. He saved money. He accumulated property, a small house, land, tools, animals. By 1841, Solomon had been married for 13 years. He and Anne had 2 children, Enos, born in 1829, and Margaret, born in 1830. By all accounts that survive in the historical record, this was a functioning family household. Solomon was known in his community as a hard-working man, a skilled tradesman, and someone of respectable standing. He was not wealthy, but he was established. He was not educated in the formal sense, but he was literate and intelligent. He was not powerful in any institutional sense, but he had achieved a degree of security that most working men of his era, black or white, could only aspire to. The question of how Solomon maintained this status in a society increasingly defined by racial division is important. The northern states had gradually abolished slavery over the previous 50 years, but they had not eliminated racism. Indeed, the North developed its own system of racial exclusion and control. Black workers were excluded from many trades and professions. Black people were segregated in housing and public spaces. Black people had limited access to quality education and social advancement. And crucially, the legal status of free black people remained ambiguous. Free papers, documents certifying freedom, could be forged. They could be misplaced or destroyed. And if a black person was taken south or sold into slavery by unscrupulous traders, the legal mechanisms to prove freedom were almost non-existent. Solomon Northup inhabited this precarious existence. He had built a life, but that life was not guaranteed. He was free, but his freedom depended on circumstances that he could not fully control. This is the essential context for understanding what happened next. The vulnerability that would lead to his capture was not primarily a product of his individual choices or circumstances. It was structural. It was inherent to the position of free black people in mid-19th century America. In the spring of 1841, Solomon was working on the Champlain Canal and other local projects. By April, he had accumulated some savings and was in relatively good financial condition. It was at this moment that he encountered two men who identified themselves as musicians and circus performers. Their names, as Solomon later recalled them, were Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They proposed a specific opportunity. They were organizing a traveling circus and needed musicians. They asked if Solomon would be interested in joining them for a week or two, traveling to Washington, D.C. to perform. They offered payment, generous payment for the time involved. They suggested the experience would be enjoyable and lucrative. For reasons that Solomon explained later, but that remained somewhat mysterious. Even to contemporary historians, he decided to take this opportunity. Perhaps he was attracted to the income. Perhaps he was intrigued by the chance to travel and perform. Perhaps there was something in the personalities of these men that seemed trustworthy. Perhaps he simply made a calculated decision that the risk was acceptable. The historical record provides his reflection on this choice, but not the full complexity of his reasoning in the moment. All we know is that he agreed to travel with Brown and Hamilton to Washington, D.C. Before departing, Solomon made an important decision. He left instructions with a trusted friend, a man named Henry B. Northup, to watch over his family while he was gone. This choice, ensuring someone knew his intentions and whereabouts, would later prove crucial to his eventual liberation. Solomon also withdrew money to support his family during his absence. He was making arrangements as a responsible man would, planning to return after the engagement was complete. On the journey to Washington, the three men stayed in hotels and moved through towns. Solomon noted nothing unusual until they arrived in the nation's capital. It was in Washington, D.C. that the situation began to change. Brown and Hamilton suggested they visit a restaurant to eat. They drank together. According to Solomon's account, he consumed alcohol. He later described the drink as having been adulterated or drugged, though he could not be certain of the exact substance. What he did know was that he rapidly became extremely ill. He described losing consciousness. What happened next is the transition point. When Solomon regained consciousness, he was in darkness. He was chained. He attempted to shout, and his voice was quickly suppressed by a man who beat him into silence. He learned in those first moments of awareness in the darkness that he was imprisoned. He was no longer in control of his circumstances. He was no longer legally free, or rather, he was no longer able to exercise or claim the freedom he had possessed only hours before. In that room, he was informed of his new status. He was told that his name was now no longer Solomon Northup. He was told that he was property. He was told that he had been purchased and that he now belonged to someone else. He was told that he was from Georgia or from some other southern state and that he had been enslaved from birth. He was told that any claim to freedom would be met with severe punishment. He was told that he should abandon the identity he had possessed and accept the identity that was being imposed upon him. This process, this psychological and institutional stripping away of identity, happened in the space of hours. The initial location appears to have been a slave pen in Washington, D.C., operated by a trader named James H. Birch. Birch is a name that appears in records of the period and in Solomon's account. For the duration of the period that Solomon was held in this pen, he was subjected to the basic processes of commodification. He was examined, his body assessed for strength and capability. He was subjected to violence designed to break his will to resist. He was renamed. He was denied access to writing, materials, or communication with the outside world. He was separated from his documentation, the papers or forms that might have proven his free status. During this time, Solomon faced a choice that would define his survival strategy for the next 12 years. He could announce his true identity and attempt to prove his free status through legal claims. This path seemed theoretically possible. He was in Washington, D.C., where there were legal institutions. But practically, the mechanism for a black man to prove freedom in a slave pen, without documents, without access to lawyers or communication with the North, was almost non-existent. A slave trader would have every incentive to dismiss such claims as delusions or deceptions designed to undermine the transaction. The trader had paid money for Solomon, and that investment created its own legal pressure to ignore any inconvenient claims of freedom. The second path was to remain silent about his true identity and attempt to survive the present moment. This path involved accepting the narrative being imposed on him, that he was an enslaved man named Platt Hamilton, one of several names he would be called over the coming years. It meant living with the knowledge of his own identity while appearing to accept the false identity being enforced. This psychological division would be required to sustain hope for eventual liberation while functioning under slavery's demands. This was the path Solomon chose. After a period of time in the pen in Washington, Solomon was purchased by a man named William Ford. Ford was a plantation owner in Louisiana, and he transported Solomon south by ship, the Deep South, the cotton regions, the heart of the slavery apparatus. This journey itself was an ordeal. Men and women were chained together below deck. Food was minimal. Sanitation was non-existent. Disease was constant. Several people died during the passage. Solomon arrived in Louisiana transformed, thinner, weakened, initiated into the bodily reality of slavery. William Ford was a slaveholder of the sort common in 1840s Louisiana, moderately prosperous, working his enslaved workers at the edge of survival, operating within the legal framework of slavery but not necessarily brutal, in the manner sometimes represented in contemporary memory. Ford owned a plantation, Bayou Boeuf, in the Red River region. It was this location that would be Solomon's primary place of captivity for the next several years. The work on Ford's plantation was agricultural and logistical. Solomon was assigned to various tasks: felling timber, clearing land, working in the fields, performing construction and skilled labor. He did this work because he had no alternative. The choice to refuse was met with the threat of beatings. The reality of punishment for disobedience was demonstrated frequently enough that the threat was credible. This combination of coercion created a system in which the enslaved person's own will became, in a sense, irrelevant. They performed labor because resistance was futile and punished, not because they chose to do so. But within this catastrophic situation, Solomon discovered a psychological and practical survival strategy. His skills as a tradesman, his ability to build, to repair, to construct with wood, made him valuable to Ford. His ability to play the violin made him occasionally useful for entertainment and potentially for Ford's social standing. These capacities allowed Solomon a degree of slightly better treatment than some other enslaved people on the plantation. Better rations, slightly less frequent punishment, Assignments that were dangerous but also skilled rather than purely manual. The Bayou Bouf region was itself a kind of landscape of despair. It was swampy, disease-ridden, isolated from any possibility of flight or communication. The enslaved population was large, worked to the point of collapse, and managed through a system of terror. Overseers, white men employed by Ford to enforce discipline, were present constantly. The threat of sale deeper into slavery to more distant plantations was perpetually present. An enslaved person who became troublesome could be sold to someone worse. This hierarchy of horror created a calculus in which even brutal conditions might be accepted as preferable to worse alternatives. Solomon does not provide extensive descriptions of day-to-day experience during this period. The surviving account is necessarily selective, shaped by memory and the editorial process. But what emerges is a picture of someone navigating an inhuman system while attempting to maintain an internal sense of self. He performed his labor. He developed relationships with other enslaved people. He observed the system, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, its personnel. He played his violin when permitted, and this music became something like a thread connecting him to the person he had been before his capture. After approximately 2 years with William Ford, circumstances changed. Ford's financial situation deteriorated. Ford faced financial pressures and decided to sell some or all of his enslaved people to raise capital. Solomon was sold to a new owner. This sale represented a significant danger because it removed him from a situation in which he had established himself as useful and relatively known. A new owner was unpredictable. The new situation could be far worse. The new owner was a man named Edwin Epps. Epps lived on a plantation also in the Bayou Bouf region, not far from Ford's property. But where Ford had been relatively moderate by the standards of slaveholders, Epps was different. Epps was violent. Epps was prone to rage. Epps was a man whose personality seemed structured around the exercise of power over enslaved people. Epps had married a woman named Mary Epps, who shared, according to Solomon's account, her husband's casual cruelty toward the enslaved. The conditions on Epps's plantation were worse than on Ford's. The work was harder. The punishment was more frequent and more severe. The rations were smaller, the oversight was constant, and inflamed by Epps's volatile temperament. Epps employed an overseer who was a tool of his will, but the violence often came directly from Epps himself. He kept a whip and used it. He demonstrated absolute power and seemed to take pleasure in its demonstration. On Epps's plantation, Solomon again attempted to carve out a survival strategy. His skills remained valuable. He was able to perform tasks that less skilled workers could not. He was still able to play music, and occasionally Epps would demand that he play, sometimes forcing him to play while witnessing punishments of other enslaved people, creating a grotesque intimacy between entertainment and brutality. This forced participation in the machinery of oppression created its own kind of psychological damage, but survival required accepting such assignments. During this period, Solomon witnessed and in some cases directly experienced extreme violence. He documented encounters with other enslaved people whose resistance or perceived disobedience resulted in beatings, mutilations, and worse. He observed a system designed to prevent any possibility of resistance through the cultivation of terror. He saw people broken by the system, their will to resist destroyed, their connection to humanity severely damaged. Solomon's account includes descriptions of specific brutal incidents. One enslaved person, a woman named Patsy, was subjected to extraordinary violence, beatings, sexual assault, humiliation. Solomon, forced to witness and sometimes to participate in these scenes, by having violence administered in his presence or by being forced to perform tasks while others were punished, was forced to internalize the message. This is what resistance costs. This is what speaking up costs. This is what attempting to claim humanity within this system costs. Yet Solomon continued. Year after year, he performed the labor. He maintained the internal knowledge of his true identity and his free status. He observed the system and occasionally found small moments of connection with others who were enslaved. He played his music when permitted. He survived through a combination of obedience, utility, restraint, and the suppression of his own need for recognition and resistance. The psychological cost of this survival strategy is almost impossible to fully estimate. Solomon was living with a constant knowledge of his own legal freedom. Documents still existed in the North, proving his free status, while being forced to act as though he accepted his enslaved condition. He was aware of his own humanity while existing in a system designed to deny it. He was performing compliance while maintaining internal resistance. This psychological division, sustained over years, represents a kind of torture that leaves no visible marks. Part 3. The 12-Year Cycle, 430 Yaga, 815 Asay. Section 3a, The Rhythm of Captivity, 430 Idandusk, 545 Bugs. Slavery in the antebellum Deep South operated according to rhythms tied to agricultural production. The cotton cycle, planting, growing, picking, governed the structure of the enslaved people's lives. The year began with preparation. Spring and early summer involved cultivation. Late summer and fall involved the harvest, the most intense period of labor when the enslaved population was worked at maximum capacity. Winter provided a period of slightly reduced intensity, though work continued. Solomon experienced this cycle repeatedly over 12 years. This repetition itself became a kind of torture. Unlike a prisoner serving a defined sentence, Solomon had no legal endpoint to his captivity. The system of slavery provided no mechanism by which an enslaved person could earn freedom through time served or good behavior. Freedom existed only through escape, through purchase by a willing owner, or through legal action, all of which seemed impossibly distant from Solomon's position in Louisiana. The physical toll of this cycle, 12 complete cycles of planting and harvesting, of maximum labor and relative reduction, of constant risk and constant work, would have been severe. Solomon was physically strong and capable, but even strong bodies deteriorate under such conditions. He was likely malnourished, exposed to disease, subjected to injuries from the work and from punishment. Aging would have accelerated. The psychological cost would have been compounded by the physical degradation. But within this cycle, Solomon learned to navigate the specific system of power on Epps's plantation. He understood Epps's moods and patterns. He understood which tasks were safer and which carried greater risk. He understood the other enslaved people, their vulnerabilities, their strengths, their strategies for survival. He understood the seasonal patterns and how to move through them with minimum damage. Part of his survival strategy involved his violin. Music became a tool. When Epps was in a certain mood, music could shift his temperament. When Epps wanted entertainment, Solomon's ability to provide it created a kind of value. This is not to say that this protection was absolute or reliable, Epps could turn on Solomon regardless of past usefulness. But it created a probability structure in which Solomon's skills increased his odds of survival. Another part of his survival involved the development of relationships. Despite the isolation in the system's attempt to prevent solidarity among the enslaved, Solomon developed connections. He worked alongside others, saw others suffer, and in the brief moments of non-work time, attempted to maintain some form of human connection. These relationships were themselves fraught with danger. Emotional connection created the possibility of greater psychological pain if something happened to others. But the alternative, complete isolation, may have been psychologically worse. Section 3b, the strategic waiting, 545 says, 815 Naugsidiern. Throughout the 12 years, Solomon maintained a strategic awareness that liberation was theoretically possible. A man named Henry B. Northup, the trusted friend to whom Solomon had entrusted information before his capture, presumably knew that Solomon had departed for Washington, D.C., and had not returned. Though the historical record does not provide extensive documentation of Henry B. Northup's activities during Solomon's captivity, the existence of someone in the North who knew Solomon's real identity and knew of his disappearance created a point of contact for potential rescue. Additionally, Solomon was aware in a general sense of the broader political context. The northern states, with increasing intensity, were opposing the expansion of slavery. There was a growing abolitionist movement. There were legal and political mechanisms, however imperfect, through which the wrong of slavery was being challenged. This awareness, however distant and however unlikely to personally benefit him, may have sustained a belief that freedom was not absolutely impossible. But this awareness did not translate into immediate action. Solomon could not, from his position in Louisiana, directly contact anyone in the North. He had no access to writing materials. He had no access to communication. He was isolated. The system of slavery was explicitly designed to prevent such communication. An enslaved person who attempted to contact the North would be severely punished. What Solomon could do was wait. This is perhaps one of the most psychologically demanding forms of human experience. To wait for liberation knowing that the wait may be indefinite, that it may never end, that it may only terminate in death. To maintain hope while recognizing the reality of hopelessness. To survive the present moment while believing that some future moment might be different. Some scholars have suggested that during this period, Solomon may have attempted to communicate with sympathetic white people, perhaps overseers, perhaps other white people he encountered. The exact details are unclear from the surviving accounts, but there are suggestions that Solomon may have been seeking ways to communicate his true identity and his desire for liberation. Whether such attempts occurred and what their consequences were remain partly obscured by the historical record and by the editorial choices made in the publication of Solomon's narrative. What is clear is that 12 years passed, 12 years of labor, 12 years of survival under threat, 12 years of psychological maintenance, keeping alive an internal sense of self while performing compliance, 12 years in which the person Solomon had been before his capture, the violinist, the cooper, the free man married to Anne with children named Enos and Margaret, remained alive only in his mind and in his intermittent ability to play music. The system seemed designed to be permanent. There was no obvious mechanism by which Solomon would be liberated. He was one enslaved person among millions. He was not famous. He was not the subject of newspaper accounts or public campaigns. He was a man whose false identity was accepted and legalized by everyone in his immediate vicinity. His claims to freedom would seem, to any observer in Louisiana, to be the delusions or deceptions of an enslaved man attempting to escape his condition. Chapter Part 4, The Liberation, 815 Basri, 11 Sibalafyon. Section 4a, The Search from the North, 815 Nadas, 915 Mine. In 1852, 11 years after Solomon's capture, an event occurred in New York. Henry B. Northup, the man to whom Solomon had entrusted information before departing for Washington, finally acted. Whether delayed by uncertainty, by lack of resources, by his own attempt to investigate Solomon's disappearance gradually, or by circumstances now lost to history, Henry B. Northup began to take formal steps to locate Solomon. Henry B. Northup appears to have contacted the governor of New York and appealed for assistance. The state of New York, operating under laws that technically protected the rights of free citizens, agreed to investigate. New York sent an agent, a man named Samuel Bass, to Louisiana with orders to locate Solomon and determine his status. Samuel Bass traveled south with the specific mission to find a man named Solomon Northup who might be enslaved under false pretenses in Louisiana. Bass traveled to the Bayou Boeuf region. He made inquiries. This was itself a dangerous mission, as the southern states' legal systems were structured to protect slavery and to view any northern interference as threatening. An agent from New York searching for an allegedly enslaved free man would not have been welcomed, but through perseverance or good luck, or the cooperation of individuals whose names and motives are not fully documented, Bass was able to locate Solomon on Edwin Epps's plantation. The identification would have been startling for Solomon, a representative from the North, appearing out of the landscape of captivity, offering the possibility of liberation. The confrontation between Bass and Epps would have been tense. Bass had legal authority as a representative of New York, but Epps had the legal authority of Louisiana's slaveholder, and the local legal system would have been structured to support Epps's claim to property. Bass would have had to carefully navigate this confrontation, asserting Solomon's freedom while not provoking such immediate violent rejection that he would be unable to extract Solomon from the situation. The exact details of how Bass negotiated Solomon's release remain partly obscure. According to some accounts, Bass purchased Solomon's freedom, paying Epps as though Solomon were truly property and as though this transaction were legitimate. This payment would have allowed Epps to save face. He had not been forced to release Solomon, but had instead engaged in a commercial transaction. It would also have provided Bass with a legal mechanism to remove Solomon from the plantation, without triggering a direct legal confrontation. The ambiguity of this mechanism is important. By paying for Solomon's freedom, Bass was, in a sense, validating the system that had enslaved him. Epps's claim to ownership was treated as legitimate, and the purchase of freedom reinforced the property logic of slavery. Yet it was also the practical mechanism that worked. It removed Solomon from captivity in a way that did not require defeating the entire Louisiana legal system. Section 4b, The Return. 9 11 Gahas. Solomon left Louisiana with Samuel Bass. The journey north must have been extraordinary, traveling from the landscape of captivity into gradually changing legal and social systems. The further north Solomon traveled, the more he was moving into territory where his free status could be recognized, where his claims to identity would be supported by law and by the presence of people who knew him. The reunion with his family must have been extraordinarily complex. Solomon's wife Anne had lived for 12 years believing her husband was dead or lost. She had raised their children without him. The family had continued their life, but not the life that Solomon had left behind. Now, suddenly, after 12 years, the man whom they had grieved or abandoned hope for reappeared. Solomon's children, Enos and Margaret, would have been young men and women. They would not have complete memories of their father. The reunion would have been reunification with someone who was simultaneously their father and a stranger. The trauma to the family was not limited to Solomon's experience of captivity, but extended to the entire family's experience of his disappearance and his eventual return. Beyond the family, Solomon's return to the north created a legal question. What would be done about his captivity and sale? He had been kidnapped. He had been falsely sold into slavery. Multiple people, the men who had drugged H.,